9 Golden Age stars who got lobotomized, or were nearly forced to. Hollywood's golden age conjures images of glamour and stardom. Elegant actors and actresses living extraordinary lives under the studio spotlight. But behind the glittering facade lurked a darker reality. Stars who struggled with mental health issues in an era when psychiatry was primitive and often brutal. The 1930s through the 1950s saw the rise of a procedure so barbaric that it's almost unimaginable today: the lobotomy, a treatment that involves severing connections in the brain's prefrontal cortex, usually by inserting a metal pick through the eye socket or drilling holes in the skull. The procedure was designed to calm patients, but often left them shells of their former selves. For Hollywood stars, whose emotions were their instruments and whose personalities were their currency, this treatment was especially devastating. Some of cinema's brightest lights faced this terrifying procedure, while others narrowly escaped it through luck, intervention, or privilege. Today, we're exploring one of Hollywood's most disturbing secrets: the stars who were lobotomized or came dangerously close to suffering this irreversible procedure. Their stories reveal not just personal tragedies, but the darker side of Hollywood's studio system, a system that viewed performers as commodities to be controlled, even if that meant destroying the very minds that made them special.
I'm very happy to be here tonight to let people see that I am the kind of person I am.
1. Frances Farmer, Hollywood's rebel destroyed. When Frances Farmer burst onto the Hollywood scene in the 1930s, she seemed destined for superstardom. With her striking beauty, raw talent, and fierce intelligence, she stood out among the carefully manufactured starlets of the era. Films like Come and Get It, 1936, showcased her extraordinary range and intensity, earning comparisons to legends like Greta Garbo. But Farmer was also outspoken, independent, and unwilling to play by Hollywood's rigid rules. She refused to attend studio publicity events, spoke candidly to the press, and challenged directors when she disagreed with their vision. In an industry built on control, such behavior was unforgivable. They called her difficult. They turned her into a zombie. Farmer's downfall began with a series of arrests for disorderly conduct and assault in the early 1940s. Her increasingly erratic behavior, likely exacerbated by alcohol abuse and possibly undiagnosed bipolar disorder, provided the perfect pretext for removing her from public life. In 1943, she was institutionalized at Western State Hospital in Washington, beginning a 7-year nightmare in various mental institutions. What exactly happened to Farmer during those years remains controversial. According to her autobiography, Will There Really Be a Morning?, published posthumously and possibly embellished by others, she endured horrific abuse: assault by orderlies, being hosed down with cold water, forced to eat her own feces, and subjected to electroshock therapy without anesthesia. The most disturbing allegation involves a transorbital lobotomy, the infamous ice pick procedure pioneered by Dr. Walter Freeman, who traveled the country performing lobotomies with assembly line efficiency. While no definitive medical records confirm Farmer underwent this procedure, many who knew her described a profound personality change after her institutionalization. She wasn't the same person, recalled a former colleague who visited Farmer after her release. The fire was gone. Her eyes were empty. It was like talking to someone wearing a Frances Farmer mask. Whether Farmer actually underwent a lobotomy remains one of Hollywood's most disturbing mysteries. Some biographers insist it happened, while others argue her personality changes resulted from years of electroshock therapy, medications, and trauma. What's undeniable is that the vibrant, challenging actress who entered the institution never truly emerged. After her release in 1950, Farmer attempted a comeback, even hosting a local TV show in Indianapolis for a few years. But she never returned to major films. The brilliance that had made her special had been extinguished, whether by a lobotomy or the cumulative effects of years of institutional abuse. Farmer died of esophageal cancer in 1970 at age 56, largely forgotten until the 1982 film Frances, starring Jessica Lange, revived interest in her tragic story. Her fate stands as a chilling reminder of the price paid by women who defied Hollywood's expectations in an era when difficult behavior could be pathologized and treated through barbaric means. The tragedy of Frances Farmer isn't just what was done to her, notes film historian Margaret Barnes. It's that we'll never know what she might have become. A whole career, a whole life, was essentially erased because she refused to be controlled. 2. Rosemary Kennedy, America's hidden tragedy. Though not a Hollywood star herself, Rosemary Kennedy's story intersects with celebrity culture through her connection to America's most famous political dynasty. As the sister of future President John F. Kennedy, future Senators Robert and Ted Kennedy, and future Rat Pack adjacent Patricia Kennedy, who married actor Peter Lawford, Rosemary's fate offers a stark illustration of how even the most privileged families could be destroyed by the lobotomy craze. One operation erased her personality and her place in the family. Born in 1918, Rosemary was a beautiful young woman who struggled with behavioral issues and learning difficulties from childhood. Some historians believe she may have had intellectual disabilities resulting from oxygen deprivation during birth, while others suggest she may have had undiagnosed dyslexia or mental illness. As Rosemary entered adulthood, her behavior became increasingly concerning to her father, Joseph Kennedy Sr. She was prone to mood swings, had difficulty following rules, and, most alarming to the image-conscious Kennedy patriarch, showed interest in men and sexuality at a time when such behavior in unmarried women was considered scandalous. In 1941, without consulting his wife Rose, Joseph Kennedy made a decision that would haunt the family for generations. He authorized a prefrontal lobotomy for his 23-year-old daughter. The procedure was performed by Dr. Walter Freeman and his partner, Dr. James Watts. With Rosemary awake during the operation, Freeman asked her to recite poems and count backward while he cut into her brain with a small knife. They continued cutting until she became incoherent and could no longer respond. The results were catastrophic. Rosemary, once capable of writing in her diary and participating in society, was left with the mental capacity of a toddler. She could no longer speak coherently, walk properly, or care for herself. The vibrant young woman who had danced at embassy balls was now severely disabled. The lobotomy was a catastrophe, writes Kennedy biographer Lawrence Leamer. Rosemary's personality was obliterated. She was left permanently incapacitated. The Kennedy family's response was to essentially erase Rosemary from their public narrative. She was sent to a psychiatric institution in Wisconsin, where she would remain hidden from public view for decades. The family told friends she was reclusive or teaching at a school for disabled children. Her siblings were discouraged from visiting her. It wasn't until after Joseph Kennedy's death that Rose Kennedy began visiting her daughter regularly, and not until the 1960s did Rosemary's siblings reconnect with her. By then, more than 20 years of isolation had compounded the damage from the lobotomy. Rosemary lived until 2005, dying at age 86. In her later years, she received better care and more family visits, but she never recovered from the procedure that had robbed her of her future decades earlier. The Kennedy family's eventual acknowledgement of Rosemary's condition did lead to positive change. Her sister Eunice Kennedy Shriver founded the Special Olympics, in part inspired by Rosemary's plight, and the family later supported improved mental health initiatives and disability rights. Nevertheless, Rosemary Kennedy's story serves as a stark reminder of how women's behavior was pathologized and treated in mid-century America, even in the most privileged families. Her lobotomy wasn't performed to help her, but to make her more manageable for others, a motive that drove thousands of similar procedures during this dark chapter in psychiatric history.
More when I got through than when I started.
What was your problem?
But the doctor, that's what everyone had.
3. Jean Tierney, beauty saved from the scalpel. Jean Tierney epitomized Hollywood glamour in the 1940s. With her striking cheekbones, overbite, which became known as the Tierney bite and inspired cosmetic dental work among female fans, and mesmerizing green eyes, she became an icon in films like Laura, 1944, and The Ghost and Mrs. Muir, 1947. But behind her perfect facade, Tierney struggled with devastating mental health challenges that nearly led to a lobotomy. She played angels on screen and was nearly silenced forever off it. Tierney's descent into mental illness began with a series of personal tragedies. During her pregnancy with her first child, she contracted rubella, German measles, after exposure to a fan who broke quarantine to meet her. The infection caused her daughter to be born with severe disabilities, including blindness, deafness, and intellectual disabilities, a reality that haunted Tierney with guilt, despite it not being her fault. A subsequent miscarriage, marital problems with her husband Oleg Cassini, and the pressure of maintaining her career while caring for her disabled daughter pushed Tierney into a severe depression. By the early 1950s, Her mental health had deteriorated to the point where she was struggling to function on film sets. "I had no peace of mind," Tierney later wrote in her autobiography. "I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I couldn't do anything but cry." In 1953, after what she described as a near self-harm attempt, Tierney checked herself into the Harkness Pavilion in New York. Thus began a years-long odyssey through various psychiatric institutions, where she was subjected to 27 electroshock treatments, procedures that were performed without anesthesia, causing intense pain and memory loss. The treatments didn't help. If anything, they worsened her condition by impairing her memory, which was crucial to her acting career. As her condition failed to improve, doctors began discussing a more drastic intervention, prefrontal lobotomy. It was at this critical juncture that Tierney's husband, Oleg Cassini, intervened decisively. Despite being separated from Tierney at the time, Cassini was horrified by the proposed lobotomy and adamantly opposed it. "I would rather have Jean with all her problems than a lobotomized version of her," Cassini reportedly told doctors. "The person who would come out of that operating room would not be Jean." Cassini used his connections and influence to prevent the procedure, advocating for less invasive treatments. His intervention likely saved Tierney from suffering the same fate as Frances Farmer and countless other patients who were lobotomized during this era. Eventually, Tierney found her way to the Menninger Clinic in Kansas, where she received more humane treatment. She also benefited from the emerging field of psychopharmacology, with new medications that helped stabilize her condition without the devastating side effects of electroshock or lobotomy. By the late 1950s, Tierney had recovered enough to resume her career, though she never regained the star status she had enjoyed in the 1940s. She later married Texas oil baron W. Howard Lee and found a measure of peace in her later years before her death in 1991. Jean Tierney's narrow escape from lobotomy highlights how close even major stars could come to this irreversible procedure, notes film historian Victoria Wilson. If not for Cassini's intervention, one of Hollywood's most beautiful and talented actresses might have ended up with the same empty-eyed stare that characterized so many lobotomy victims. Tierney's story also illustrates the inadequate understanding of women's mental health in the mid-20th century. Her depression and anxiety, normal responses to the genuine tragedies she had experienced, were treated as mysterious female ailments requiring drastic intervention rather than as natural grief requiring support and compassionate care.
Angered. I don't know what they yell about when I sing.
4. Judy Garland, One Step from the Scalpel. Judy Garland's struggles with mental health and substance abuse are well-documented parts of Hollywood lore. Less known is how close the beloved star of The Wizard of Oz and A Star is Born came to being lobotomized during one of her many institutional stays. They gave her pills, shock, and came one step from the scalpel. Garland's troubles began early. As a child star at MGM, she was fed amphetamines to control her weight and barbiturates to help her sleep, a studio-sanctioned regimen that initiated her lifelong struggle with addiction. By her teens, Garland was already dependent on the medications that the studio dispensed like candy. "They had us working days and nights on end," Garland later recalled. "They'd give us pills to keep us on our feet long after we were exhausted. Then they'd take us to the studio hospital and knock us out with sleeping pills. After 4 hours, they'd wake us up and give us the pep pills again." This cycle of uppers and downers, combined with constant studio pressure about her weight and appearance, created perfect conditions for mental health crises. By her mid-20s, Garland was experiencing severe depression, anxiety, and substance dependency. She attempted self-death multiple times, including a well-publicized incident in 1947 when she slashed her wrist with a broken glass. Judy was in a very dark place by the late 1940s, explains Garland biographer John Frick. She had been fired by MGM. Her marriage was falling apart, and she was physically and emotionally exhausted from years of studio abuse. She was desperately in need of compassionate care, but what she got was something quite different. During one of her institutional stays in the early 1950s, doctors treating Garland's depression and addiction issues began discussing lobotomy as a potential solution. The procedure was still being performed relatively frequently at this time, particularly on female patients exhibiting emotional or hysterical behavior. What saved Garland from this fate was a combination of her own celebrity and the intervention of her third husband, Sid Luft. When Luft discovered that doctors were considering a lobotomy, He immediately removed Garland from the facility, likely saving her from a procedure that would have destroyed her remarkable talent. Sid was no saint in their relationship, but in this instance, he absolutely saved Judy's career and possibly her life, notes Fricke. He understood that her emotional intensity, the very thing doctors wanted to fix, was integral to her artistry. While Garland avoided lobotomy, she did undergo numerous electroshock treatments throughout the 1950s and 1960s. These treatments, while less permanently damaging than lobotomy, still caused significant memory problems that affected her ability to learn lyrics and dialogue, a devastating side effect for a performer. The electroshock treatments were traumatic, recalled Lorna Luft, Garland's daughter. My mother would come back from these treatments and not recognize me for hours. She'd be confused, disoriented. It was terrifying to witness. Garland's struggles continued throughout her life, culminating in her accidental overdose death in 1969 at age 47. While her story is often told as a cautionary tale about addiction and the price of fame, it should also be understood as an example of how easily psychiatric treatments could become tools of control rather than healing, especially for women whose emotions were deemed excessive or inconvenient. Judy Garland's near miss with lobotomy underscores how vulnerable even the biggest stars were to extreme psychiatric interventions, reflects Fricke. For every Frances Farmer who didn't escape the procedure, there were others like Garland who narrowly avoided it, often through luck or connections rather than any rational medical decision-making.
He had nothing to declare except his genius. Everybody knows that.
5. Ruth Ford's brother, Charles Henry Ford, artistic sacrifice. Charles Henry Ford occupies a unique place in the overlapping worlds of literature, art, and avant-garde cinema. As the brother of actress Ruth Ford, who appeared in films like Another Face and was married to actor Zachary Scott, Charles Henry moved in Hollywood-adjacent circles while maintaining his primary identity as a poet, editor, and filmmaker in the experimental scene. What makes Ford's story particularly disturbing is the allegation that he voluntarily submitted to a lobotomy in the 1940s, a claim that has circulated in literary and artistic circles for decades. They said it would make him calmer. It made him disappear. Born in 1908, Ford was a pioneering surrealist poet and editor of the influential literary magazine View. He moved in elite artistic circles, collaborating with figures like Salvador Dalí, Marcel Duchamp, and Jean Genet. His 1933 novel, The Young and Evil, co-written with Parker Tyler, is considered one of the first openly gay novels in American literature. Ford was also involved in experimental filmmaking, creating avant-garde works that blurred the boundaries between poetry, visual art, and cinema. His connections to Hollywood came through both his sister Ruth and his own artistic endeavors on the fringes of the commercial film world. According to persistent rumors in literary circles, Ford underwent a lobotomy sometime in the 1940s, supposedly as a treatment for his homosexuality and what doctors of the era might have diagnosed as nervous tension or artistic temperament. Some accounts suggest he sought the procedure voluntarily, believing it would help him achieve emotional stability without sacrificing his creative abilities. If true, this would represent one of the most tragic miscalculations in literary history. The procedure that Ford allegedly hoped would calm his anxieties while preserving his artistic genius instead diminished both his emotional range and creative output. There's a marked difference in Ford's writing before and after the mid-1940s, notes literary historian James Gifford. His earlier work has a feverish intensity and experimental brilliance. His later poetry, while still accomplished, lacks the same vitality and boundary-pushing quality. Something fundamental changed in his approach. What makes Ford's case particularly unsettling is the possibility that he chose the procedure, a reflection of how normalized lobotomy had become by the 1940s, with over 20,000 procedures performed in the United States alone. Dr. Walter Freeman, the procedure's most enthusiastic proponent, actively marketed lobotomy as a solution for everything from depression to homosexuality to artistic temperament deemed too intense. Freeman was essentially selling lobotomy as a kind of emotional tune-up, explains medical historian Dr. Elena Canas. His before and after photos showed patients going from disturbed to docile. What he didn't emphasize was that docile often meant diminished in every sense, intellectually, emotionally, and creatively. Ford lived until 2002, dying at age 94 after decades of continued work as a poet, photographer, and artist. While he remained productive, Many who knew him in his early years spoke of a fundamental change in his personality and artistic approach after the 1940s, a change consistent with the effects of lobotomy, though never definitively confirmed. The story of Charles Henry Ford's alleged lobotomy highlights a particularly insidious aspect of the procedure's history. Its marketing not just as a last resort treatment for severe mental illness, but as an elective procedure for anyone seeking emotional regulation. Even brilliant artists who risk sacrificing the very sensitivity that made their work exceptional. If Ford did indeed choose lobotomy, it represents one of medicine's cruelest ironies, reflects Gifford. A procedure that promised to free his creativity from emotional turbulence instead may have severed the very connections between emotion and expression that made his early work so revolutionary.
Hang on, you're doing fine.
6. Diana Barrymore, Hollywood royalty fallen. Diana Barrymore was Hollywood royalty by birth, the daughter of legendary actor John Barrymore and poet Blanche Ulrichs. With her famous name and striking looks, she seemed destined for stardom when she made her film debut in 1942's Eagle Squadron. But Diana's promising career would be derailed by alcoholism, mental health issues, and a series of personal tragedies that led to psychiatric institutionalization and rumors of a possible lobotomy. Born into fame, cut down by madness, Diana's challenges began with the burden of her famous name. The pressure to live up to the Barrymore legacy was immense, especially given her father's towering reputation as one of America's greatest actors. John Barrymore, however, was largely absent from Diana's life, and their few meetings were disappointing encounters with a man ravaged by his own alcoholism. "I was a Barrymore," Diana later wrote in her memoir, "Too Much, Too Soon. I had to be a star, but I felt like an imposter trying to be something that I wasn't prepared to be." Diana's film career lasted just 3 years and 8 films. None particularly successful. As her professional disappointments mounted, she turned increasingly to alcohol, following the destructive pattern that had claimed her father, who died of complications from alcoholism in 1942, just as her career was beginning. By the late 1940s, Diana's alcoholism had progressed to the point where she was experiencing blackouts, violent outbursts, and suicidal ideation. After a series of public incidents, including arrests for drunkenness and disorderly conduct, she was institutionalized multiple times between 1947 and 1949-1953, disappearing from public view for extended periods. It was during these institutional stays that rumors of a possible lobotomy emerged. While no medical records confirmed such a procedure was performed, Diana's friends noted alarming changes in her personality after certain hospital stays, changes consistent with the effects of either lobotomy or extensive electroshock therapy. She wasn't the same person after one particular hospitalization, recalled actor Ginger Rogers, who had known Diana before her troubles escalated. The sparkle was gone from her eyes. She seemed vacant, like someone had turned out the lights inside her. Other friends disputed this assessment, attributing Diana's changed demeanor to the cumulative effects of alcoholism, psychiatric medications, and electroshock treatments rather than lobotomy. The truth remains uncertain, buried in sealed medical records and conflicting accounts. What is known is that Diana attempted to rebuild her life in the mid-1950s. She appeared on television, performed in summer stock theater, and published her best-selling memoir in 1957. These efforts at recovery, however, proved short-lived. On January 25, 1960, Diana Barrymore was found dead in her apartment at age 38. The official cause was an overdose of alcohol and sleeping pills, though whether this was accidental or intentional remains unclear. Diana Barrymore's story epitomizes the particular vulnerability of Hollywood royalty, notes celebrity biographer William Mann. The children of famous performers faced enormous expectations while often lacking stable foundations. When they faltered, the same industry that had exploited their famous names often abandoned them to institutional solutions that could be more damaging than the original problems. Whether Diana actually underwent a lobotomy may never be confirmed, but the persistent rumors reflect a disturbing reality of the era. Psychiatric institutions often used extreme measures on patients whose fame made them both valuable and vulnerable. Valuable as successful cases for ambitious doctors. Vulnerable because their mental health struggles carried the additional stigma of tarnishing legendary family names. 7. Clara Bow, the Solonst It Girl. Clara Bow defined the Roaring Twenties with her vivacity, sexual magnetism, and explosive screen presence. As Hollywood's original It Girl, she represented the freedom and rebellion of the flapper era, starring in over 50 films before abruptly disappearing from public life in the early 1930s. The circumstances surrounding her retreat from fame and the psychiatric treatments she received in subsequent decades include disturbing rumors of a possible lobotomy. The It Girl became the forgotten woman. Bo's rise to stardom was meteoric. Born into poverty and abuse in Brooklyn, she escaped her circumstances through acting, winning a magazine contest that brought her to Hollywood. Her natural screen presence and uninhibited performance style made her an immediate sensation. In films like It, 1927, and Wings, 1927, Bo radiated a joyful sexuality that captivated audiences and defined the liberated spirit of the 1920s. The transition to sound films initially seemed successful for Bo, her distinctive Brooklyn accent adding authentic character to her performances. Behind the scenes, however, she was struggling. Years of exploitation by studios, financial manipulation by her father, and relentless scrutiny from the press had taken a severe toll on her mental health. Everyone wanted a piece of Clara, explains film historian Janine Bassinger. The studios worked her relentlessly, making 8 or 9 films a year. The press invaded her privacy and sensationalized her love life. Her father stole her money. She had no protection from any of it. By 1931, Bo was experiencing symptoms that today might be diagnosed as anxiety, depression, or possibly bipolar disorder. She suffered insomnia, panic attacks, and emotional volatility. After a series of public incidents, including highly publicized court cases involving a former secretary who blackmailed her, Bo withdrew from Hollywood, ostensibly for a rest cure. This temporary break became permanent. Apart from 2 final films in 1933, Bo never returned to the screen. She married actor Rex Bell and retreated to their Nevada ranch, where she lived in increasing isolation as her mental health continued to deteriorate. In the 1940s, Bo was diagnosed with schizophrenia, a questionable diagnosis that may have reflected the era's tendency to pathologize women's emotional responses to genuine trauma. She was institutionalized multiple times over the following decades, receiving treatments that likely included electroshock therapy. The most disturbing allegations involve a possible lobotomy or similar psychosurgical procedure during one of these institutional stays in the 1950s. While no medical records confirm such a procedure, friends who visited Bo in her later years described alarming changes in her personality and affect. The Clara I knew had been vibrant, talkative, full of life, recalled actress Blanche Sweet after visiting Bo in the 1960s. The woman I saw was a shell, quiet, remote, with a strange emptiness in her expression. It was like visiting a ghost. Similar observations from other visitors fueled speculation that Bo may have undergone a lobotomy or extensive electroshock treatment that fundamentally altered her personality. Some accounts suggest that her husband, Rex Bell, may have authorized such treatments during periods when Bo was deemed incapable of making her own medical decisions. Whether these rumors are accurate remains uncertain. What is clear is that the vivacious, spontaneous actress who had embodied the spirit of the 1920s spent her final decades in seclusion, heavily medicated, and disconnected from her former life. She died in 1965 at age 60, largely forgotten by the industry and public that had once adored her. Clara Bow's trajectory from It Girl to isolated patient represents one of Hollywood's most tragic falls, notes Bassinger. The qualities that made her a star, her emotional expressiveness, her natural sexuality, her uninhibited nature, were later pathologized as symptoms to be treated and controlled. Whether through lobotomy or other interventions, the psychiatric establishment effectively silenced the woman who had given voice to a generation's desire for freedom.
Say, I'll have to beat her to a phone if I'm going to make the deadline. Are the wires up yet?
Not until morning.
8. Francis D's relative, Hollywood's hidden shame. Francis D. enjoyed a successful acting career from the 1930s through the 1950s, appearing in films like Little Women, 1933, and I Walked with a Zombie, 1943. Married to actor Joel McCrea for 57 years, she was part of Hollywood's inner circle, a position that gave her insight into the industry's darkest secrets, including a particularly disturbing story involving a lobotomized relative that she reportedly shared with close friends late in life. One hospital visit, one operation, and they were gone from the family albums. According to accounts from Dee's confidants, she occasionally spoke about a female relative, variously described as a cousin or niece, who had been lobotomized in the late 1940s after exhibiting behavior that threatened to create a scandal for the family. This young woman, who had Hollywood aspirations of her own, allegedly had a relationship with a prominent married producer that turned volatile when she threatened to expose their affair. Frances described it as a complete cover-up, recalls one friend who heard the story directly from Dee in the 1980s. This young woman was institutionalized, lobotomized, and essentially erased from the family history. Afterward, they simply didn't talk about her anymore. It was as if she'd never existed. What makes this story particularly disturbing is how it illustrates the way lobotomy could be used not just as a misguided medical treatment, but as a tool for controlling problematic women and preventing potential scandals. The procedure effectively silenced those who threatened to expose the hypocrisies and abuses within Hollywood's power structure. There were numerous cases of young women being institutionalized to protect powerful men, explains film historian Catherine Orison. The lobotomy was the ultimate silencing tool. It didn't just shut someone up temporarily, it often destroyed their credibility permanently. Who would believe the crazy accusations of someone who'd had brain surgery? The identity of Dee's relative remains unknown, her name apparently scrubbed from family records, and her fate hidden behind institutional walls. This anonymity makes her story both harder to verify and more representative of countless silent victims whose experiences never made it into the historical record. Dee herself maintained public silence about this family tragedy throughout most of her life, only sharing the story with trusted friends in her later years. Her reluctance to speak publicly reflects the powerful code of silence that pervaded Hollywood during the studio era, a silence that protected the industry's image at the expense of its most vulnerable participants. Frances carried this knowledge like a burden, notes one friend. She felt complicit in the cover-up because she hadn't spoken out when it happened. By the time she was willing to talk about it, most of the people involved were dead, and she worried that telling the story would only hurt the surviving family members without helping her relative. The story of Frances Dee's relative, though lacking the documentation of more famous cases, highlights a disturbing reality of the lobotomy era. For every well-known victim whose story eventually came to light, countless others disappeared into institutions, their identities erased and their stories untold. These nameless victims represent the true scope of the lobotomy tragedy, reflects Orison. We know about Frances Farmer because she was famous before her institutionalization. We'll never know about the aspiring actresses, the difficult wives, or the inconvenient mistresses who were silenced permanently through psychosurgery. 9. Unnamed starlets. The studio system's disposable women. While the stories of celebrities like Frances Farmer and Jean Tierney eventually became public knowledge, they represent only the visible tip of a much larger iceberg. Throughout the 1930s through 1950s, major studios maintained systems for handling difficult young actresses whose behavior threatened to cause problems or generate negative publicity. These systems often culminated in psychiatric institutionalization and, in some cases, lobotomy. If they cried too much, complained too loudly, or loved the wrong person, they were silenced forever. The major studios, particularly MGM and Warner Brothers, had well-established protocols for dealing with troubled contract players, explains entertainment lawyer and Hollywood historian Thomas Peterson. They maintained relationships with certain doctors and private sanitariums where problematic actresses could be sent for rest cures that sometimes involved much more invasive interventions. These difficult women fell into several categories. Some were young actresses suffering from genuine mental health issues exacerbated by the pressures of Hollywood. Others were women who had experienced sexual harassment or assault by powerful men and threatened to speak out. Still others were actresses whose sexuality, particularly bisexuality or lesbianism, was deemed a potential public relations problem. The studios presented themselves as upholding moral standards, but their primary concern was always protecting their investments and their image, notes Peterson. Young actresses represented significant financial investments. If they couldn't be controlled through conventional means, more drastic measures were considered acceptable. Documentary evidence of these cases remains sparse, as studios were careful to keep such matters out of written records. However, numerous accounts from nurses, orderlies, and administrative staff who worked at institutions like Norwalk State Hospital and Camarillo State Mental Hospital in California describe a pattern of young women from the entertainment industry being admitted under questionable circumstances. There was a steady stream of these girls, Beautiful young women who seemed more angry or defiant than genuinely ill, recalled one former Camarillo nurse in an interview conducted in the 1990s. They would arrive accompanied by studio representatives rather than family members. Some would protest that they were being committed against their will, but once the paperwork was signed, they had no recourse. Treatment records from these institutions show that electroshock therapy was routinely administered to female patients diagnosed with hysteria, nervous exhaustion, or sexual deviance, vague terms that could encompass virtually any behavior deemed inappropriate for women of the era. In more severe cases, particularly those involving women who explicitly threatened to expose studio abuses, lobotomy was sometimes employed. The lobotomy was the nuclear option, explains Peterson. It wasn't used often because it essentially destroyed the investment the studio had made in developing these actresses. But in cases where the potential damage from an actress's revelations outweighed her value as a performer, it was considered an acceptable solution. The stories of these unnamed women, contract players whose promising careers mysteriously ended, bit players who disappeared from Hollywood without explanation, aspiring actresses who never got their big break after speaking out against abuse, form a hidden history of Hollywood's golden age. We'll never know how many potential stars were essentially erased through psychiatric interventions, reflects film historian Victoria Wilson. These women's stories haven't been told because the procedures used against them were specifically designed to ensure they couldn't tell their stories, couldn't remember them clearly, couldn't articulate them effectively, or wouldn't be believed if they tried. The legacy of these unnamed victims lives on in Hollywood's ongoing struggles with systemic abuse and the silencing of victims. While the lobotomy itself has been relegated to medical history, the impulse to silence difficult women, through whatever means available, remains a troubling aspect of entertainment industry culture. The tools have changed, notes Wilson, but the underlying dynamics persist. Today's silencing mechanisms are NDAS, settlements with confidentiality clauses, and career destruction rather than lobotomies. But the fundamental goal, controlling narratives and protecting powerful interests at the expense of vulnerable individuals, remains disturbingly similar.